So in a ColdFusion application, we can have session management enabled. Session management means that the ColdFusion server will allocate a separate memory space for every unique user that interacts with the ColdFusion application. And the lifespan of this session is determined by the session timeout. And that's basically the inactivity window in which we'll keep that session alive. In this case, we're going to say 30 minutes, which means that the user has 30 minutes to interact with the ColdFusion server before ColdFusion expunges that unique memory space. Now, in a traditional ColdFusion application, usually there's enough network activity to keep that session alive as the user interacts and makes requests to the application server. But in the case where a ColdFusion server might render a very long-lived page, such as a user having to read a document or maybe solve a puzzle or interact with a prototype, there's a chance that the user might interact with a already rendered page for longer than the session timeout, which means that in order to keep the session alive, we're going to have to ping the server in the background prior to that 30-minute window in order to let ColdFusion know that the user is still active. This technique is called a heartbeat, and pretty much every approach to this problem that I've seen uses a heartbeat, but there are differences in the way that heartbeat is implemented on the client-side application. Now, the heartbeat usually hits a heartbeat endpoint, and that heartbeat endpoint doesn't really have to do anything. It just has to be routed through the ColdFusion application server so that ColdFusion knows that the user is still around, usually based on incoming cookies. Now, to see this in action, I've created a demo here where a user would load this page and we have a text area, and that text area is going to provide a place for us to enter a really long message, theoretically a message that will take longer than that 30-minute session timeout to enter. Now, because we don't want the session timeout to fire, what we're going to have to do is trigger network requests in the background periodically, again, to let the ColdFusion server know we're still around. Now, I don't want to call it the naive, but the simple approach would be just to bind to a bunch of events and then perhaps throttle network activity, right? Because we don't necessarily want to trigger network requests for every scroll and mouse and key event, because you'd essentially be DDoSing or denial of service attacking your own server. We definitely don't want to do that. So a super simple approach would be to bind to all these events and then just throttle the network requests. But the thing I don't like about that approach is that you're still adding the processing overhead of all of the event handlers, and there's really no need to do that. So instead, what I'm going to do is create a solution that delays these event bindings by some period of time. In this case, I'm going to use 10 seconds. That's very low, but that's very low for the purposes of this demo so that we can actually see this taking place. And what this is going to do is it's going to defer the binding of these events to a future period. Then once those events get fired, they're going to be unbound, and then that timer is going to be reset. So let's take a look at this. So the first thing we're going to do here is start our heartbeat timer, and that's going to do exactly what I just said. It's going to use the browser's native timer to call this function 10 seconds in the future. And the setup the heartbeat events is going to iterate over our array of event types. That's this collection up here. So it's going to iterate over each of those: mouse move, scroll, key down, and it's going to add an event listener to the window, and they're all going to call the same event handler. Now, in this case, to get a little fancy, I'm going to add some options to the event listener. These are not strictly necessary, but having a passive event helps a little bit with performance, and doing once really just tells the browser to unbind after the event has been triggered. But we're going to do that anyway. So again, this isn't strictly necessary. This was me just having a little bit of fun with the demo. So what does this handle heartbeat trigger event do? Let's scroll down here. The very first thing it does is it unbinds all of the event handlers, because we don't need every event interaction to trigger a network request to the ColdFusion server. We only need one network request in our window to tell the ColdFusion application server that this user is still active and therefore their session should be kept alive. So if the user, for example, does a mouse move, we don't need to then listen for scroll events and click events as well. So we're going to tear down all of those events, and then we're going to restart that heartbeat timer. And again, all that's going to do is set up a timeout to call this method again 10 seconds into the future. So every time any of these events fires, we reset that window to trigger a heartbeat. Now, after we've teared down the events and then reset the timer, we're going to hit that heartbeat endpoint on the ColdFusion server using some sort of AJAX technology. In this case, I'm just using a simple fetch request because I didn't want to pull in a dependency. Obviously, your approach to this is going to be heavily dependent on the tools you already have in your application, whether that's something like the jQuery AJAX module or Axios or something that you built yourself. Again, the heartbeat doesn't actually have to do anything. All it has to do is tell the ColdFusion server that this user is still alive, and it's going to do that probably through cookies, which is naturally how we manage sessions in ColdFusion. And that's all there is to it. So let's take a quick look at how this works in the browser. Let me refresh, and let's just start typing a long message. And you can see we just passed that 10-second window. We set up our heartbeat event bindings, and then immediately a key down event was detected as I was typing, and a heartbeat was pinged. And then as I was just talking, another 10-second window passed. We set up another round of heartbeat event bindings, but that time it was the mouse move. And we can see, and let's go ahead and just start scrolling up and down here, and just to show you that other events will work. And in a few seconds here, we'll see that the event is going to be bound, and then immediately our scroll event was detected and our heartbeat was sent to the server. And that's really all there is to it. You just have to periodically let the ColdFusion server know that the user is still interacting with the page. And of course, if the user has stepped away, none of these heartbeat event bindings will get triggered, and eventually the server session will just time out. And the next request, even if it's a heartbeat request, should probably lead to some sort of a 401 unauthenticated or 403 forbidden, something to that effect. The one thing that I didn't really want to get into in the demo here was what to do if that network request fails. That's going to heavily depend on what tools you're using. So I didn't want to add it because of that complexity and because it's going to be very specific to your application. You might have an AJAX client that has retry capabilities built in, or you might have to implement them yourself. Or in the case of an error, maybe what you want to do is just reset this timer, but using a much shorter duration, maybe like 60 seconds. But again, that's going to be very specific to your application. All of the approaches to this problem use a heartbeat that I've seen, but it's these kind of low-level details that sets one solution apart from another. So hopefully, even if you don't like my approach, I provided some inspiration for you to implement your own approach. And if nothing else, let me just welcome you to the ColdFusion community. I think you're really going to have a great time here. ColdFusion is just a wonderful language, and the community is equally wonderful. So hopefully this was helpful.